death, and constant danger. The unbearable stench of rotten flesh. Pain, fear, exhaustion, thirst, and hunger amidst rats and lice, mud, and constant anxiety. Close quarters combat with relentless shelling, daring charges, and night raids. Counterattacks, bayonets, clubs, and underground tunnels. Bombs, poison gases, and snipers. Two sides focused on one brutal objective: to destroy the enemy at all costs. This was the inescapable daily life of trench warfare during the First World War, in which hundreds of thousands of young lives would be extinguished in the most brutal ways. This video will show you a real, brutal, and detailed picture of the trenches of the First World War and what was actually happening inside them. It will make you wonder how a person can endure something so brutal for so long, as well as how it is possible for people to be so creative in finding ways to efficiently kill as many members of their own species, who were merely born in a different country by sheer chance. Prepare to hear disturbing facts from a not-so-distant war and see what a man can do to another man. Let's begin. As the First World War broke out, the nations of Europe were equipped with new and untested technologies, still unaware of their capabilities. With quick-firing rifles, machine guns, and advanced artillery systems, military strategists were uncertain of how these innovations would influence the new conflict. As the war began, initial movements were swift, with traditional tactics of mobility and maneuver. However, these tactics soon faced the devastating reality of modern firepower. The catastrophic losses incurred during these early engagements forced a dramatic shift in strategy. By late 1914, after the Battle of the Marne had halted the German advance through France, both the Allied powers and the Central Powers were compelled to adapt. Soldiers, faced with this new kind of firepower, began to dig. Although seeking protection by digging into the ground was not a new concept, this time it would define an entire war. This desperate race for a positional advantage saw both sides constructing extensive networks of trenches as they attempted to outflank one another, eventually stretching from the North Sea to the borders of Switzerland. Now, with nowhere else to go, both sides desperately tried to break each other's lines. Charge after charge, attack after attack, each with enormous losses. When that wasn't successful, horrifyingly brutal battles began, searching for a solution to this new kind of war, so creative yet so terrifying that it will make your skin crawl. It was here, in the muddy graves of the Western Front, that the true horror of conflict revealed itself. Artillery was the primary cause of battle casualties, inflicting devastating losses and destruction. Machine guns mowed down men as they charged across no man's land. However, close-quarters combat, though not frequent, was exceptionally savage when it occurred. Soldiers, desperate to survive and kill, used anything from rifle bayonets and trench knives to makeshift clubs and shovels. There were no rules. During trench raids, with the goal to kill enemies, capture prisoners, and collect intelligence, the brutality intensified. The confined, muddy space of enemy trenches made traditional bayonets impractical. They often became lodged in opponents and were hard to use in small spaces. Soldiers instead improvised, sharpening spades and creating improvised weapons such as clubs and knives for more effective melee combat. Hand-to-hand fighting techniques such as boxing, wrestling, and jiu-jitsu were adapted to the gruesome needs of trench warfare, focusing on killing the enemy by any means necessary, including snapping necks or crushing windpipes. By 1915, trench raids had become a grim routine. Raiders armed themselves with weapons suited to the brutal close combat anticipated in these encounters. Colt and Browning pistols, various revolvers, and particularly pump-action shotguns, nicknamed trench brooms, were favored for their lethal efficiency at close range. As the war dragged on, soldiers increasingly relied on trench knives, with knuckle-duster grips and skull-crushing pommels, as well as hatchets and sharpened trench shovels, showcasing the brutal nature of trench warfare. Beside hand-to-hand combat, soldiers faced a range of brutal methods designed to kill or horribly wound them. Flamethrowers and poison gases such as chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas choked, suffocated, blinded its victims, and inflicted painful burns and blisters that could become fatally infected. It also made a tremendous psychological impact on soldiers, wondering each time during the shelling, is it gas? When they applied their gas masks, are they sealed tight? Would the gas come through? Even if everything went relatively all right, the gases could be on clothes in liquid form. and later when soldier thought he was safe in warm dugout, it would vapor again, horrifically killing everyone in the shelter. Barbed wire in no man's land could entangle soldiers on night raids, leaving them helplessly exposed to enemy fire. The ground beneath their feet could become deadly, as mining operations beneath concluded with soldiers digging tunnels towards each other, trying to plant massive explosives that obliterated trenches and men, leaving monstrous craters and changing the landscape. Grenades could shred groups of men with shrapnel. Snipers turned no man's land into a deadly game of hide-and-seek, with each peak potentially met with a fatal bullet. The landscape was littered with booby traps, rigged to maim or kill with the slightest disturbance. An artillery shell or rifle shot could come at any time from anywhere, reminding soldiers that death was always lurking behind their necks. Each new day in the trenches could be one's last, as soldiers lived in constant fear of the next, unseen, creative, and terrifying method that might end their lives or leave them grotesquely wounded in the mud-soaked hell of the Western Front. However, 99% of the time, men were caught between the dullness of waiting and the anxiety of an impending attack. Soldiers were rotated between the front lines, support trenches, and rest areas, though rest was hardly what the name suggested. The conditions varied drastically with the seasons. Mud swamped the trenches in the rain, with many instances of soldiers falling into craters filled with mud and water, even drowning while comrades watched, unable to help. Freezing conditions immobilized men in the winter, and the summer brought swarms of mosquitoes and flies feeding on decomposing bodies. The continuous shelling transformed the landscape into a wasteland, with craters and upturned earth as far as the eye could see. Rats followed closely, grew huge and fat, feeding on the corpses that littered no man's land. These rats were not only a psychological terror, but also a practical threat as they spread disease and ate limited rations. Soldiers adopted cats, or used improvised traps to combat the rat infestation. But these methods offered little respite. They even bit pieces of faces off sleeping soldiers, crawling over them and squeaking in the dark. Lice were another constant torment, spreading trench fever, which debilitated thousands. German and Russian forces even declared a temporary ceasefire and banded together to hunt wolves that were attracted to the gruesome scavenging available in the war zone and attacked soldiers and civilians. Fresh packs would appear in place of those that were killed by the Russian and German troops. As their hunger worsened, the wolves became braver in their efforts to kill and eat the soldiers. Occasionally, both sides cooperated during brief truces to collect bodies or share moments of humanity, like the Christmas truce of 1914. Also, night patrols were standard procedure. Repairing trenches and barbed wire could only be carried out at night, and the slightest sound could give away the whole action and provoke gunfire from the entire front. Night patrols sometimes encountered the enemy during reconnaissance, and many times they would let each other pass, knowing that if anyone fired, it would draw fire from the entire front in their direction. Guards listened intently and watched every sound and movement at night to prevent surprises, which nonetheless happened, often fatally. Hygiene was a luxury soldiers could scarcely afford. The impossibility of regular bathing and the unavailability of proper sanitation facilities meant diseases spread rapidly. Dead bodies sometimes lay unburied for weeks, creating a stench that permeated everything and a visual horror that haunted soldiers day and night. Unofficial truces sometimes arose when both sides agreed to stop firing for periods, allowing for the retrieval of bodies or the rescue of the wounded from no man's land. These moments, however, were punctuated by treachery, with soldiers sometimes using these breaks to plan attacks. The wounded often lay screaming in the gaps between the trenches, their cries haunting their comrades for days until they either died or were rescued under the cover of darkness. Daily life was a horrific cycle of sleep deprivation, fear of bombardment, and the constant sight and smell of death and decay. This unending exposure to the elements, the enemy, and the continuously present threat of death from above or from the creeping horrors on the ground defined the brutal reality of trench warfare. Therefore, the next time we lose our temper because the internet is a bit slower, we should think about the constant, to put it mildly, discomforts and inconveniences these people faced for years. Those who were lucky enough to survive these horrors. I think spending even one day in a trench would break any of us today, both physically and mentally. And we need to preserve these stories from being forgotten so that they do not repeat themselves. And so, that the incredible sacrifice of the people who survived all this, so that we could exist, would have meaning and purpose.